Welcome to the deep dive. So, you want to know more about all those perspectives surrounding the Russia-Ukraine war and what NATO's got to do with it, right?
Sounds like it.
Well, today we're going deep into a source you might not expect. The comment section of a TikTok video.
Oh, interesting. A TikTok video, huh?
Yeah. It's about some breaking news in Ukraine, and let me tell you, the comments are a gold mine. It's like raw, unfiltered public opinion, you know? You get to see what narratives are really taking hold out there online.
I can see how that would be fascinating. Social media has become this, well, a huge platform for these global discussions, even on apps like TikTok that are, known for entertainment.
Absolutely. And while these comments might not represent the whole world's view, they definitely show us how certain perspectives, well, how they kind of take root. So getting into it, one of the first things that jumped out at us was a wave of comments that were, well, they were critical of NATO. And not just critical, some were even supportive of Russia's actions in the conflict.
Right, and there's some pretty common arguments popping up again and again. The big one seems to be this idea that NATO is the aggressor, that they provoked Russia.
Yeah, like they're saying Russia's invasion was just a defensive reaction to NATO expanding eastward. Basically, they shift the blame to the West.
That's it.
Like one commenter asked, would the U.S. ever allow China to set up a military base in Mexico? Of course not. So why should Russia tolerate NATO in Ukraine?
Interesting analogy.
Yeah, maybe not a perfect comparison, but it gives you an idea of how some people see it. Like they think Russia felt threatened, pushed into a corner by NATO.
Right. And it's not all about what's happening right now either. Lots of commenters are bringing up history, too. This whole claim that NATO broke a promise they made after the Soviet Union collapsed.
Oh, yeah, the broken promise. Like there was this verbal agreement that NATO would disband, but obviously that never happened.
Exactly.
One comment that stuck with me said, the Soviet Union kept their end of the bargain when they dissolved. NATO did not. Now, whether or not there was an actual formal agreement, well, that's debatable. But this idea that a promise was broken, it really fuels that whole narrative that NATO can't be trusted, like they're unreliable on the world stage.
It's a powerful narrative.
Yeah.
And you can see how these comments blend historical claims, some true, some not, to support their point. It really highlights how important it is to think critically, especially online where information spreads so fast.
Oh, for sure. Speaking of information, let's talk about how Ukrainian President Zelensky is portrayed in these comments. Some people are painting him as, well, almost as a villain, like he's corrupt and controlled by NATO and the EU.
Interesting.
It's like they're trying to demonize him to discredit the other side.
It's a tactic you see a lot. But why Zelensky specifically?
That's what I was wondering.
Well, if they can paint him as a puppet of the West, it reinforces that idea that Ukraine isn't really acting on its own, that this whole conflict is a proxy war orchestrated by bigger powers, There's this one comment that says, Trump was right all along. Zelensky is a criminal con man. He's in it for the money. NATO and the EU are pulling the strings.
Whoa.
So it's not just criticizing Zelensky, it's bringing in pre-existing political biases, which just makes the whole thing even more complex.
Yeah, that's a pretty bold statement. Shows how existing political opinions get mixed up with the conflict.
Exactly. And it doesn't stop there.
Yeah.
You also see some globalist conspiracy theories popping up, like this idea that there are these shadowy elites who control NATO and have some secret agenda.
Right.
It goes beyond just not trusting a single institution. It's suspicion of larger power structures.
Yeah.
Controlling everything.
Like there are comments saying NATO is just a tool for the globalists. The U.S. needs to pull out.
Right.
So you see this deep skepticism of international cooperation, this belief that there are these hidden powers pulling the strings.
It's a common thread in these kinds of discussions. But it's important to remember, even though these views are expressed so strongly in the comments, it doesn't mean they represent everyone's opinion,
Definitely not. This is just a glimpse into one corner of the online world. To really understand, you need to look at all sides, analyze the information carefully. But yeah, there's a lot to think about here.
There is. And one thing that really struck me is how many comments thank the creator of the video.
Oh yeah, like they're grateful for the information?
Yeah, there's so many that say things like, thank you. 90% of people don't know this. Or it's amazing how many are unaware of this perspective. Thanks for sharing.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? For a lot of these viewers, this perspective, criticizing NATO, supporting Russia, it's like they've never heard it before. Like it's new information, an alternative viewpoint.
Exactly. And it shows how powerful social media is in shaping how we see things. It bypasses those traditional gatekeepers,
Yeah.
Creates spaces where alternative narratives can really flourish.
It really makes you think about how hard it is to navigate all the information online, especially with something as complex and emotional as this war. It feels like there's a lot more to unpack here.
There is. In the next part, we'll look at what these narratives really mean, and we'll talk about how to have, well, meaningful conversations online about this conflict, which is not easy. But for now, take a second and think about what stood out to you in these TikTok comments. What are your initial thoughts? What's your reaction? It's pretty amazing when you think about it. It's like all these comments,
Right.
even though they're worded so differently, they kind of come together. They build this counter narrative,
Yeah.
like challenging the mainstream Western view of the whole conflict.
It is, isn't it? It's almost like they're creating their own understanding of what's happening, using these historical stories, opinions on the leaders, and even conspiracy theories to fill in the blanks. It makes you wonder how they create their own narratives.
That's the thing about this digital world we live in. Information isn't just coming from the top down anymore. Regular people, they have the power to share their own version of things, and they often find an audience online with others who think the same way.
And some of these comments are really, well, bold in what they're saying. Things like, NATO is the one who started this war, period. Or NATO is a terrorist organization. It's not even questioning the mainstream view anymore. It's straight up pushing back.
Yeah, and that assertive tone, well, it could be coming from a place of frustration, maybe distrust towards the media and what they're being told. It's like they're saying, we're not going to just accept this, we're going to push back.
Right. It's like they're taking back control, challenging what they see as misinformation by putting out these alternative views.
Exactly.
Remember that comment we talked about earlier, the one that said, "Thank you, 90% of people don't know this." It's interesting, isn't it? What do you think that means?
Well, it shows you that for some people, finding this perspective, the one that criticizes NATO and supports Russia, it feels like they've uncovered some hidden truth. Even if it's, well, not exactly based on facts. But that feeling, that sense of discovery, it can be really powerful.
It makes them hold on even tighter to those beliefs. So we've talked about the general feeling, those common arguments, some specific examples. But what does all this mean for the person listening? Why should they care about what's happening in these TikTok comments?
That's a great question. Well, for starters, it shows how important it is to be media literate, especially in today's world. You have to be able to look at the information you see online, consider where it's coming from, check the facts, and be aware of any biases.
Like, what is it, that old saying, don't believe everything you read? That's so true, especially online. Even if it sounds convincing or comes from someone you trust, you still got to do your own research.
Exactly.
Form your own opinion based on the facts.
Right. And it's important to remember that, well, there aren't always easy answers to complex situations like this war. There are multiple sides to every story. And understanding those sides, even if you disagree with them, it can help you see the bigger picture.
It's like putting yourself in someone else's shoes. Even if you don't agree with them, trying to understand where they're coming from, it can lead to better conversations.
Absolutely.
More productive conversations.
Right. And speaking of conversations, these comments, well, they really highlight how difficult it is to talk about these things online. It doesn't seem like there's much room for respectful debate in those comment sections.
Some of those comments are pretty intense. It feels more like people are digging in their heels than actually wanting to have a real conversation.
I see what you mean. The anonymity of being online, the fast pace, it creates these echo chambers where people mostly talk to others who agree with them. And that can make it really hard to find common ground.
So if that's the case, is it even possible to have productive conversations about these complex issues online? How do we get past the shouting matches and actually learn from each other?
It's a tough one. But I think the first step is recognizing that even in those really strong opinions, there's often this desire to be understood, a search for truth, even if it's, well, seen through their own particular lens.
Like they're saying, this is what I believe and here's why. Even if their logic is a bit off or based on misinformation, they're still trying to make sense of it all. So how do we tap into that?
I think empathy and listening are key. Instead of just dismissing someone's viewpoint, try to understand what's behind it. What are their fears? What motivates them?
So asking questions, trying to clarify things, even just acknowledging how they feel, even if you don't agree with their conclusion, that can make a difference.
Exactly. It's not about winning an argument or changing someone's mind right away. It's about creating a space where people can talk respectfully
Yeah.
and hopefully understand each other better. even if they disagree.
It sounds like a big challenge,
It is.
but it's definitely something worth trying.
Absolutely. And remember, it's not just about the individual comments themselves, but what they tell us overall. By analyzing those patterns, we can learn a lot about how narratives are built online, how information spreads, and how public opinion changes over time.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening so far. We've seen some strong opinions, some interesting trends in how people view this conflict in NATO, but we're not done yet.
There's still more to explore. In our last part, we'll step back and look at the bigger picture. What does all this mean in the real world, especially for those who are seeing these narratives without the context we've been discussing?
That's a really important question. Join us as we wrap up this deep dive into this fascinating and complex topic. Okay, so we've spent some time in these TikTok comments, seeing how people are talking about this conflict online, right? But what happens when these ideas, well, what happens when they leave the internet? What are the real world effects of these alternative narratives, especially for people who, they might be seeing them without all the context we've talked about?
It's a crucial question for sure. The real danger is that these narratives, especially the ones that, well, aren't totally accurate or are
Right.
just based on certain facts, they can turn into really strong beliefs. And once someone really believes something, it's almost impossible to change their mind, even with solid evidence.
It's like they build a wall around their worldview, right? Anything that doesn't fit, well, it's seen as a threat instead of a chance to learn. It's like once they think they have all the answers, they don't want to hear anything else.
Exactly. And this refusal to even listen to other viewpoints, it can have big consequences. It affects everything from how we talk about politics to how governments make decisions that impact the whole world.
We've already seen how these narratives shape public opinion, even elections. But imagine if the people in charge, the ones making decisions, were only getting their information from these echo chambers. It could lead to, well, mistakes, maybe even bigger conflicts, because they're not seeing the whole picture.
It's a scary thought. That's why it's so important to question things. To be skeptical, I mean.
Right.
We need to be willing to, challenge what we think we know,
Yeah.
be open to different ideas, even look for different perspectives on purpose.
It's like eating healthy, but for your mind, right? Don't just consume information that agrees with what you already think. You got to challenge yourself, see things from other angles, even if it makes you a little uncomfortable. That's how we learn and grow.
That's a great way to put it. And, looking at different perspectives, it doesn't mean you have to agree with them. It's about understanding, about having a more complete view of the world, which is super important with issues as complex as this conflict.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into TikTok comments and what they tell us about the Russia-Ukraine war, I want to leave you with something to think about. Given all these strong opinions, these alternative stories going around online, how can we, each of us and the world as a whole, how can we have more informed, more constructive conversations about these really complex global issues?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's not easy. But I think it starts with each of us. We have to be responsible about what we read and believe, be willing to have real discussions, respectful debates, but most importantly, remember that everyone, even those we disagree with, they're human.
We can't forget that. Every comment, every opinion comes from a real person who's just trying to figure things out. And that's something to remember no matter where we get our information.
Couldn't agree more. Trying to understand each other, it's an ongoing thing. There's always more to learn, more viewpoints to consider, and new ways to talk about it all.
That's a great point to end on. So stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking those tough questions. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.